Hello and welcome to Autology, the podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. Today's episode is a mobility-centric recap of last week's annual CERAWeek conference, and you're here with me, Elisha Thakorlal, and Graham Evans, Director of Electrification Technology Research with S&P Global Mobility. Hi, Graham, and thank you for joining Autology again.
Hello, Elisha. Yeah, great to be back on the podcast.
Wonderful to have you. So, like I said, today's episode is all about CERAWeek, held once again in Houston, Texas. It's billed as the world's premier energy event and described by the Financial Times as the Davos of Energy. It is in its 42nd year now, I believe, and this year's key theme was multidimensional energy transition, markets, climate, technology, and geopolitics. Maybe to start with, Graham, could you tell us a bit more about the scope of CERAWeek as a conference and S&P Global Mobility's presence there, and even perhaps expand a little on what those key themes entailed?
Absolutely, yeah, be glad to. It's a really fascinating spectacle, to be honest. It's predominantly, fundamentally, an energy gathering. About, I think, over 8,000 attendees this year, so another record attendance. We have plenary sessions involving our vice chairman, Dan Yergin. He's also one of the founders of CERA, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, that's now part of S&P Global. So Dan speaks with many of the major energy CEOs. You've got the likes of Saudi Aramco there, Exxon, Chevron, etc. So lots of dialogue around energy demand, oil demand, etc. As you can imagine, the political discourse continues to be a major element of the conference. Of course, geopolitics and energy are inherently related. John Kerry was there again this year. US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm was there again this year. And also some more specific kind of, let's say politicians with an energy focus, the likes of Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy, Joe Biden's climate advisor John Podesta was there. So it's quite US centric, but not necessarily always. I would say this executive level of attendance extends right through the conference, even to my panel. I was fortunate enough to have EVgo CEO Badar Khan on my panel. In terms of the themes, I think they do reflect a bit of a shift versus last year, and multidimensional in the title reflects the fact that, let's say, one size doesn't fit all in terms of our future energy need. The aspiration may well be that, let's say, renewables is the path to a net zero future, but of course, lots of aspects of the energy transition are happening at different pace and for good reason. And sadly, also conflict and politics and let's say the fragile nature of democracy in certain parts of the world naturally have a part to play in this. I think from my perspective, this came across in a few different ways in terms of the themes and the discussions around the conference. Lots of discussion around AI, artificial intelligence, and its opportunities to really transform business as usual, how to do things better, faster, more efficiently with the opportunities that AI throws up. Also, the energy implications of this and let's say the demand for the impact of the demand for more processing power and driving the need for data centers. Data centers wasn't really something I'd really thought about much before the conference, really. But as you can imagine, crunching such huge quantities of information to constantly deliver artificial intelligence and machine learning functionality, this requires it's really an energy intensive process. A bit like that, for people who understand mining of Bitcoin, you're kind of constantly doing all of this crunching of numbers, and this is effectively what we're going to need in the future in order to keep all of this autonomous functionality, autonomous driving functionality, for example, as a mobility application, but all of this artificial intelligence capability. How do we really keep on top of that need? So there was lots of conversations around this. Financing of the energy transition was a big topic. Who should really be paying for this and how should it be paid? The big consensus around, let's say, private sector led, government enabled was a kind of a nice way to describe it. So obviously the private sector sees opportunities to develop and grow and make profit from this energy transition. But of course, the government has to enable it and drive it in the right direction in order to make sure it happens in the appropriate locations and is stimulated appropriately. I think back to the theme of the conference, this need for an orderly transition was stressed, and I thought there was a very valid and pertinent observation from a guy called Bill Hess, who is the CEO of Hess Corporation, that by 2030, in order to get us on the path to net zero by 2050, we need to be spending some $4 trillion a year. And that actually last year in 2023, only $1.8 trillion was spent towards this energy transition. So, of course, there's not enough money being spent yet in order to make these types of challenges feasible. Of course, this is coming from a guy who's the CEO of a major oil corporation that's about to be acquired by Chevron. So you could argue that he has something of a vested interest. But at the same time, the point is very valid. You know, that it's not necessarily the case that we can transition to these renewable energy sources if the money just isn't there. So really, you know, really interesting balance to the discourse, let's say. It was hard to go to everything. There were so many sessions running concurrently and so much to digest. So that was probably my key takeaways from the time I had.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot to take in. But if we dive into some of the more mobility focused aspects, I mean, could you tell me a bit more about the S&P Mobility led sessions, you know, what we could take from them, as well as any other sessions straddling the mobility landscape as a whole?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'll maybe discuss specifically my session in a bit, but it was kind of like more something of a precursor to my session in that my colleague Damien Flowers, our head of financial markets, he led a session on EV adoption, which I would say it was quite an OEM centric panel, and it quickly centered on EV charging infrastructure as the bottleneck. So some quite interesting observations from that panel first, maybe, you know. Lots of discussion at the moment, and we as an S&P Global Mobility team are answering a lot of questions around some kind of like slowing of electric vehicle adoption. But the panel were quite keen to reinforce the fact that, you know, electric vehicle adoption is kind of growing 30% year on year in the US last year, and that's rather than say 40% or 50%. So it's still growing really quickly, and of course this increases the demand for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. A panelist from Toyota stating that they still believe about 80% of charging is taking place at home. So therefore, you know, for people who have the facility to charge domestically, that's still the means of choice, and therefore not being able to charge domestically is still considered something of a barrier. Interesting information from the Harvard Institute who are on this panel. Only about a third of highway chargers provide information on availability and reliability of stations. This is a massive topic, really, really important around, you know, if you want to pull up to a charger, do you know it's working? You know, do you have information on an app that tells you if it's working, if it's available, is it occupied, is it not? And obviously there's not really a means by which to book charging stations in a lot of cases. So because there's not this source of central information, it really reinforces the fact that a lack of good data is as much a problem here as it is a lack of good infrastructure. And also an interesting comment that came out of this panel that was kind of brought up by the Harvard Institute representative. She said, you know, this idea of a battery health certificate for second-hand electric vehicles is something that we will likely see in the future. You know, the idea that consumers want a degree of confidence and they want some transparency around if they buy a second-hand electric vehicle, is the battery in good shape? You know, what percentage of the original capacity is still there on the battery, and you know, is there any kind of potential for an issue? So I think this is something that will certainly come, and was a really kind of interesting and valid point. Another panel that was led by my colleague Tom de Vlieshauer, more mobility focused panel. There was some interesting dialogue on battery swapping, of something that my team has spent some time researching. And the comment from one of the panelists from Ample, which is big in the battery swapping space, was that 50% of all of the medium and heavy duty commercial vehicles that are electric on the market globally, they have battery swapping capability, which is a huge number. But bear in mind that 90% of these are in China. So I think what this tells us is that even in the medium heavy duty space, China is really taking a proactive forward, let's say, tech forward stance on battery swapping, and building their medium heavy duty commercial vehicles and buses with battery swapping capability from the off. Ampol as a company, for those of you who aren't familiar, Ampol is a company pioneering battery swapping as a kind of retrofit. They now have partnerships with OEMs, with the likes of Stellantis and Daimler Truck, in order to move the technology along. And they were keen to make the point, and this is brilliant, it's really clever. I mean, they have this effectively this adapter plate, and that means that whether you use battery swap in a Fiat 500e or a Daimler 16-wheeler, 18-wheeler truck, that the same briefcase size battery and adapter plate can be used, because these briefcase size batteries are of the same dimensions in both applications. So this can be a really kind of flexible and scalable solution moving forward. So really interesting possibilities. I think the question remains how many OEMs get on board with this as a concept. Trucking, lots of discussion around trucking, of course, big energy usage, big industry that needs to be decarbonised. Bosch was very keen on the trucking panel to promote hydrogen, still suggesting that some kind of leapfrog in battery energy density and therefore technology is required to make battery electric vehicle trucks viable. And I think that's a fair point that, of course, comes up. How many batteries would you need for some of these long distance trucks to achieve the range that they need? So again, hydrogen for the long haul, perhaps, and battery electric for the last mile delivery seems to be a bit of a consensus. But that said, efficiency is a key point in the discussion. Battery electric vehicle versus hydrogen engine versus fuel cell. And certainly, the hydrogen engine has the opportunity for a very good fuel efficiency, especially as we hybridize it. So you could have this idea of a hydrogen fueled engine with electrification to deliver a very fuel efficient powertrain that could see good application in medium heavy duty. So some interesting comments from Bosch. Separately, there was a really interesting discussion on e-fuels as well, actually, and really there's a company called HIF Global that has gone into partnership with Porsche in order to develop e-fuels. And I mean, Porsche have an interesting stake in this. Let's say they have an aspiration to be 80% battery electric by 2030. But of course, solutions are therefore needed for this other 20%, people who still rever and want the internal combustion engine. But of course, they have a very big existing fleet. Porsches are maintained and kept for a huge amount of time, and they need to honor their aspirations to reduce carbon footprint. They need a solution for the existing fleet. So e-fuels is a big part of this. What they've developed with HIF Global in a plant in Chile, of all places, is a source of refined e-fuel. No hardware or software changes required on the vehicle in order to use e-fuel rather than conventional gasoline. So that's huge. They are still doing some ongoing development work because there's something of a gap in the octane level, the peak octane level that can be achieved at the pilot plant. It's not quite high enough. But at the same time, really promising the idea that a vehicle like a Porsche 911 with the performance capability could have no hardware or software changes made to it, and it could fill up with e-fuel rather than conventional fuel. So there's this aspect around the cost, of course. Cost is king, and the energy value of the product versus the decarbonisation value of the product, the gasoline itself. This needs to be equalised with scale. And this is really what the team at HIF Global are looking to develop and deliver. So lots of interesting content. And let's say the automotive enthusiast was not struggling for interest in panels.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there was, a whole wealth of discussion points there, I mean, just in your summary alone. And just building on that, can you tell me a bit more about your panel and, who you're speaking with and what came out of the discussion for the panelists?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the panel discussion that I chaired was entitled "EV Charging Infrastructure: Is It Ready?" Let's say a deliberately provocative title. Let's say, and some might say the easy answer to that would be no. And we were quite keen with the panelists to let's say to debunk that comment or shine a bit of light on the good work that's ongoing. So I had EVgo, a charge point operator, on my panel. I had Schneider Electric, see kind of famous for their hardware, but actually doing a much broader swathe of development, implementation, optimization of holistic EV charging solutions in various parts of the globe. And then Hitachi Energy, who I would say are doing some of the kind of less fashionable aspects of this of this requirement for more power demand. They're the biggest supplier of transformers in the world. So these guys were all on my panel. Interesting stats from EVgo, maybe to kick off on station utilization. So, the CEO Badar Khan stated that 6% utilization was the most that they were achieving 2 years ago. This is now at 19%. So a huge leap in their station utilization in just 2 years. And actually, surprisingly, that Texas and Florida were among the real growth spots, which politically people might consider these to be red states or even purple states. But of course, adoption of electric vehicles increasing in some of these markets too. 50% of their energy flow was outside of California. Now it's moved to 66%. So let's say diversifying the EV adoption away from California is reflected in the utilization and the energy demand figures that EVgo have. The other important point was that this demand-based charging has actually stopped in most states. What do I mean by this? Charge point operators were often charged a one-off cost each month for the peak draw in that station, be it 350 kilowatt, 200 kilowatt. So whenever the highest power charging vehicle comes along that month, they have to pay a one-off peak charge for that peak power. That actually this has gone away in the vast majority of states now. So actually the business model is improving. And we see that in the 3,000 stations themselves that EVgo have, they are now profitable. If you take out the capital for the new stations and the expenditure and things like employee salaries. So if you like, the fundamental business now is at a stage where there's sufficient throughput and sufficient utilization for the stations themselves to be profitable. Of course, they're trying to grow the network, they're trying to build out the team, and they're trying to expand the business, and this comes with a cost. But great that the actual underlying process of charging is now profitable. We touched on microgrids with Schneider incorporating, let's say, some form of energy storage in to facilitate, let's say, charging at depots. So Schneider Electric have done a number of projects for like bus applications, whereby you might have, let's say, a number of buses coming in at a given time. They need to charge to go back out on their route. And then the microgrid there can be used to top up some stationary energy storage in order to deliver that peak power when it's required. It's interesting. I mean, we perhaps think about this type of depot application for buses and trucks as being the kind of low-hanging fruit of EV adoption because, of course, these vehicles are taking quite predictable routes, let's say like a school bus or something like this. So you can plan the charging quite well. You know when the vehicles will be stationary at the depot, and you can manage the charging demand associated with this. But it's interesting to hear the kind of success stories of these. Hitachi Energy, they were quick to reinforce the point that demand for grid equipment is really high, and in effect, if you're trying to deliver EV charging, you're actually in competition with stationary energy storage for renewables, people trying to reduce their fossil fuel consumption, even like we talked about before, these data centers for AI. So actually, sometimes for their equipment, there might be like a 5 to 10 year lead time. So it's, things like the substations and the transmission lines, they're getting put in place. They're going to need upgrading for some of these applications. They're going to need upgrading again in the future because of the increase in demand for electricity. So there's loads going on in this regard, and this can be a real bottleneck if you don't have your order in early for the equipment that you need. Permitting was a discussion across the conference in a multitude of ways. What do we mean by permitting? Getting the rights to be able to put in place and deliver your energy source or your exploration for your new, let's say, your new mineral deposits or new oil deposits. We asked this to EVgo. It's perennially been a bit of a bottleneck in terms of getting permission to put a charging station in the ground, get it wired up, get it signed off, and then get customers actually using it. Actually stating that in certain states in the US, it's a lot easier than others. Texas is easy, California isn't. And that leads to delays in deployment of new charging infrastructure. Interestingly, on a separate panel, the CEO of BP Pulse, the charge point operator, he said that in China, that a DC fast charge station could be deployed in somewhere between 90 and 120 days, start to finish. I mean, versus Western markets, this is astonishingly fast. Just the fact that they can get the job done in China so promptly and get more charging infrastructure installed. So a real difference in terms of the permitting process, country by country, let's say. Interesting question around 800 volt adoption and how much of an enabler this would be. It was something that came up in my panel. Maybe a bit of a lack of understanding about what this actually means, but of course it will facilitate much faster charging. It does have implications on the power draw from the grid. You know, the idea of, let's say, 8 Porsche Taycans coming to a charging station together and wanting to simultaneously charge at 350 kilowatts. You know, the implications, you know, you're going to need a couple of megawatts of power in order to do that, and the 800 volt architecture on the vehicle helps facilitate receiving that 350 kilowatt power. But actually the fact that, you know, this 800 volt architecture is something that we're going to see quite common even on more mainstream vehicles. You know, we've got Hyundai Kia announced they're going to use 800 volt. We've got General Motors using 800 volt on probably a fairly broad swathe of their portfolio. So it's actually something that will not necessarily remain niche for that long and will facilitate high power DC charging in the public domain. So yeah, I think my final feeling coming away from the panel and the various discussions on EV charging, I feel a bit daunted. I think that, you know, there is going to be challenges along the way in the next 5-10 years in terms of charging station deployment and what that'll mean for people's EV experience. But I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic about the technology, and there's a lot of great people working in this space in order to facilitate its deployment. And the fact that we're starting to see increasing utilization now is really encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really engaging and important discussion, and I'm pleased to hear that you're optimistic as well. But actually, on that point, do you have any broader thoughts on the impact of all this on the wider adoption of EVs? You know, especially now that you can reflect back on the conference as a whole.
Yeah, there's a couple of probably 3 points that I'll bring up that we kind of discussed at other points around the conference that I think give us, let's say, cause to be perhaps optimistic, but also be a little bit pessimistic in terms of the bigger picture. The hydrogen fuel cell topic was still there, was still around. A couple of panels discussing the role of hydrogen. Obviously, we mentioned the trucking one earlier, but interesting dialogue with some of the infrastructure providers. A colleague from Commodity Insights, Felipe Bellerio, hosted a panel. There was a kind of recent announcement that somewhat passed me by, honestly, around, you know, Shell have actually pulled out of providing the charging infrastructure in California for fuel cell vehicles. So they were quite a heavy presence as one of the major. There was basically Shell, a company called Iwatani, and then Chevron, who are providing the refueling infrastructure for fuel cell in California. So Shell pulling out is kind of a bit of a blow in this sense. And actually, there's around 3,000 fuel cell vehicles that cumulatively that have been sold in California, of which 92% are Toyotas, so like the likes of the Mirai. So actually, we've got a bit of a back step for California there, in the sense of many of these vehicles are effectively off the road because of a lack of refueling infrastructure now. And yet, despite this, there is still OEM interest and development around fuel cell. The likes of Honda have a new vehicle ready to go to market. We still know that BMW in particular are interested in this in the light duty space. So I think the panelists were quite keen to sort of temper expectations on the return on investment in the hydrogen fuel cell space. The investment is required, yes, and the investment is a long-term investment. I think the other aspect here is that, you know, and we kind of know anecdotally that reliability can be a problem with the fuel cell infrastructure. And of course, if the major application is trucking, where, you know, uptime is everything, right? That truck is your business. It needs to be working as much of the time as it possibly can. The idea that you could arrive at a hydrogen fuel cell station and it be out of order, out of commission, this just doesn't work for the trucking industry. So it's a really important aspect, and we see there that the Biden administration have offered up about $8 billion US for 6 to 10 hydrogen hubs. So this is kind of serious money that's going into the industry and looking to develop this. And obviously the likes of Bosch as a huge supplier remaining very bullish in this space is quite encouraging for hydrogen fuel cell. There was several discussions around the 1.5 degrees C that was announced back in 2015 as being the let's say the upper limit on the global planet temperature that we should limit. I think that there was a really fascinating discussion with some academics and industry figures that I attended, where they effectively said that, you know, consensus was that this was never actually possible, and that the inertia in the global temperature rise, even back in 2015, was too strong already, that we were always going to overshoot this 1.5 degree target, and that, let's say, it was somewhat more political rather than scientific in nature. So the bigger question now is actually, well, how much are we going to overshoot this target by? What are the implications, and can we kind of drag back this trajectory of change? And the comment was made that 1.5 degrees C trajectory. This is still means that island nations in places like the Pacific are still going to be underwater by 2100. So I mean, this couldn't be more important, really, in terms of the sectors that this really affects, or where we're not doing enough quickly enough. Aviation, really difficult industry to decarbonize. Steel, cement. I think the production of cement is one of those industries that's really, it goes unknown just how much carbon dioxide is generated by the production of cement. And of course, in a rapidly growing economy in somewhere like China and India, you need cement to build, right? So these are areas where transportation might be doing its bit largely. However, these other industries need to play their part. And really, there was a separate panel highlighting the impact of trying to do this in a country like Germany, where they're trying to transition heavy industry away from polluting carbon emissions to more sustainable fuels. And of course, this comes with a cost. It makes Germany less competitive as an industrialized nation, and that in itself comes with challenges around things like jobs. So it's really a huge challenge to know how quickly to decarbonize, where and when, let's say. Maybe final comments, lots of discussion around critical minerals, of course. Lots of critical minerals are critical to this energy transition. And, again, being in the US, there was something of a US focus on how the mining industry in the US operates. And the comment that was made, I really didn't know this, that actually the vast majority of the US laws on mining date from 1872, when a lot of this was established in terms of who could go and dig what out of the ground where. And therefore the point being made that really the industry is very much in need of reform. That same panel also commented that around half of the 2035 US demand for rare earths could be met by developing what we call secondary sources in places like North Dakota. So in these states where people have gone in and done a huge amount of mining already, and there's a lot of waste because they didn't want certain aspects of what they dug out the ground. Actually, if that secondary source was redeveloped again, there's actually a 50% of the rare earth requirement for the US is there already. So if this can be done in a profitable and sustainable way, this is actually a great source of rare earths. The comment from the Alaska governor was very interesting, very bullish gentleman in terms of Alaska's potential to be a source of profitable energy resource. 49 out of the 50 rare earths that exist, they're available, or they are in the ground in Alaska. They also have the largest undeveloped copper deposit in the world in a place called Pebble, which is on state land. And I was just reading a bit about this in the background. That's effectively environmental law continues to hold back any development there since its discovery in, the early 70s, and they're still trying to get things going there in order to prove that they can develop that copper deposit in an environmentally friendly way. So lots going on, and of course these are all kind of places that the technology for doing this in a more sustainable way has improved significantly over time. And also, the US has some very stringent environmental laws. They believe, and they're keen to shout about the fact that if anyone can do this mining in a more sustainable way, it's them. Interesting separate point around copper was, they apparently there's only 2 copper smelters in the US in order to process copper dug out the ground, and actually China has 50. So actually at the moment, even now, a lot of copper that is mined in the US is actually sent to China for processing and then comes back to the US for use. So of course, in terms of logistics and process, this really can't be the most environmentally friendly way to do it. So in a way, permitting reform, speeding things up, and being able to get these materials out the ground and processed nearer to source has got to be a good thing.
Absolutely interesting stuff. And finally, are there any other highlights or further comments you'd like to share about CERAWeek?
Maybe just a few. I mean, I would like to say, it's an absolute privilege to be involved, and it's great for mobility to be involved. We contribute a number of sessions to various aspects of the program, and let's say this intersection of the energy industry and the mobility industry remains pretty inseparable. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to continue to contribute our insights and our expertise, and to continue to be involved. I think the dialogue on critical mineral topics, this intersects so many areas, and obviously for batteries and for rare earths that go into electric vehicles obviously in the battery and the motors themselves, other electrified areas of the industry. I think this is going to be a huge discussion point moving forward. So it's great that we're continuing to develop our intelligence and our research around the battery topic, around critical rare earths that go into motors, for example. So I think that we can bring this to the discussion. And I think, yeah, for me, selfishly, I really enjoy this broader geopolitical dialogue that comes up at CERAWeek, and really interesting context from esteemed speakers, and being able to piece together, how this broader landscape really works. It's often we think to ourselves, why can't this happen faster, or why is it that things like this are going on in certain parts of the world? And actually, a conference like this really kind of shines an interesting light and lens on these types of global geopolitical challenges because of the people they bring together. So this is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we will be discussing geopolitics for semiconductors on the
Mm.
Autology podcast very soon. So keep an eye out for that as well. And just before we wrap up today's episode, it would be interesting to know about your own EV status, Graham. I mean, have you finally made the leap and purchased an EV? Or...
Yeah, I probably walked myself into this one, right? I mean, I still live in central London. I really don't need a car. Having a car for me is a complete indulgence. I really enjoy the EV experience so far from what I've sampled. The vehicles I've driven, and I'm very keen to embrace it. In fact, our S&P Global is about to launch an EV lease scheme for London employees. So I think this could be a fantastic perk, and I will definitely run out of excuses to make the transition at that point. I'm still doing, conducting semi-regular journeys between London and Glasgow, and I think this is the ultimate use case. I actually went into the Tesla journey planner there before, and it's still adding about 55 minutes, maybe 50 minutes to a journey from London to Glasgow
Wow.
to stop and charge rather than refuel with gasoline, let's say. So I'm afraid I'm still polluting, as my manager says. I still have my gas guzzler for now, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, look, huge technological progress being made, and we are definitely running out of excuses to move to EVs now.
Absolutely. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Graham, for joining Autology today and sharing insights on CERAWeek.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for having me, Alicia. Always a pleasure.
And thank you to all you listeners as well for tuning in. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now.